Hi class, it's Lindsay Benavides. Today I'm going to be discussing citizen approval of police use of force. Of course, this is utilizing the statistical package for social sciences software to analyze the variables that were chosen in week 1. A little overview of what I'm going to be talking about today is I'll just briefly talk about the problem basically, which is use of force, and then give a little overview on the general social survey where the variables came from. Then next I will be speaking about my independent and dependent variables. Then I will discuss their frequency tables and charts, cross tabulations, measures of association, the test of significance, and then I will conclude. So without a doubt, there's some sort of correlation between use of force and public perception. However, FLETC, which is the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, is solely responsible for defining appropriate use of force standards for all federal officers and the military, and almost all civilian law enforcement agencies follow these same standards as well, which is the model here on the left, which says Federal Law Enforcement Training Center use of force model. So modern day use of force has definitely changed significantly from landmark Supreme Court cases such as Graham v. Connor and Tennessee v. Gardner. While watching news current day, there are plenty of examples of excessive use of force conducted by law enforcement. Most interestingly, however, is the high-profile cases that capture national attention that are oftentimes in the reasonable response category of an officer, meaning they are following their use of force continuum model perfectly. Understanding the training that a law enforcement officer receives and what is considered appropriate response to subject's action is actually invaluable to a personal perception if you want to make an educated assumption based on fact, law, and training versus just that doesn't look like something that officers should be doing. Now, in order to explore citizen perception and police use of force, I am going to use the data from the General Social Survey, which is an inquiry into citizens' approval police striking by using 2 variables I've chosen, which we'll discuss next. Also, the General Social Survey is sponsored by the National Science Foundation, which is an independent agency of the U.S. government. It was also established by the National Science Foundation Act of 1950. And its main purpose is to collect annual data from randomized households across the United States. It conducts in-person interviews over a very wide variety of topics. Every citizen has an equal chance of being randomly selected to participate in the annual survey based on their address. The sample population represents each household to equal 50,000 roughly households, and that should provide equal representation of American citizens. Now, data collected between April and August of 2011 is published in the 2012 GSS dataset, which we were instructed to use. So for the 2012 dataset, a dependent and independent variable were chosen to determine citizen approval of police striking. Now, those variables that I chose were a dependent variable, which is on the right, is named poll hit OK. It is associated to the GSS data question, are there any situations in which you can imagine you would approve of police striking an adult male citizen? And the answer categories to that are A, yes, B, no, C, no answer, and D, not applicable. Now, the independent variable chosen is on the left, and it is named locked up. It is associated to the GSS data question, have you ever spent any time in prison or jail? And the answer categories associated to the independent variable are the same as the dependent, A, yes, B, no, C, no answer, and D, not applicable. Both chosen variables are nominal in nature, and the research hypothesis that I put for these two variables is, are citizens with a criminal history less likely to approve of police striking than citizens with no criminal history? The null hypothesis is then a criminal history significantly influences approval of police striking. By significantly influences, it's a negative connotation in that it actually does not influence approval of police striking. Okay, so a little bit of a literature review. I could not find exact literature on what I was looking for, but I did find some studies that were fairly close. One of those studies was a quantitative study conducted by Jeffress, Butcher, and Hanley from 2011, and it actually examined public perception of police use of force incidents, specifically if a person's individual bias attributes to their perception. Now, this study utilized a previously designed measurement tool called force factor. And force factor uses the use of force model that you see on the left, and then it measures how people feel about things that happen with the use of force model on a continuum. You can see some of those reactions in the matrix on the right. Bivariate analysis was the test of significance that was used for this particular study. Regression was measured using the force factor, and it was also used as a measure of perceptions by variability from -5 to +5, instead of the traditional methods of measuring perceptions that provide dictamized results. Interestingly, there were a lot of good questions associated to this study, but the main research question was, does objective criteria of force and resistance established by the force factor partially mediate the effects of individual characteristics and biases which are inherent to measures of perception regarding a police use of force incident? And the findings from this study did not actually support the hypothesis. Another quantitative study conducted by Kahn, Thompson, and McOwen from 2017 sought to examine public perceptions of police use of force incidents, specifically if the suspect's race and/or presence of mental illness influenced individual attitudes associated to the participants' perception. Ordinary least square regression was used to measure the three-way interactions between the variables, and factorial analysis of variance was conducted to determine support for police use of force. The particular research question was, how does suspect race and mental illness status affect public support for police use of force? And the research study was proven to support the hypothesis and that mental illness in a minority suspect is differently perceived than in a white mentally ill suspect. Moving on, back to my own variables. Now, we ran frequency tables and charts in week 2 or 3. The independent variable output shows there was 1,748 total valid responses to the question. 226 of those responses, or 226 responses were missing. 220 of those were missing as described as inapplicable, and 6 were described as no answer. Of the valid responses, 259 respondents answered yes, that they had actually been in prison or jail, which is 14.8% of the surveyed population. 1,489 respondents answered no, that they had never been in prison or jail, which is about 85% of the surveyed population. Now, for the dependent variable, it showed 1,974 people surveyed with 1,279 total valid responses to the question. 695 were missing. 636 of those were described as inapplicable. 58 were described as don't know, and 1 was described as no answer. Of the valid responses, 880 respondents answered yes, that they approve of police striking a male citizen, which is 68.8% of the valid survey population. 399 respondents answered no, that they do not agree with police striking a male citizen, which is 31.2% of the valid surveyed population. Now, here are the charts. The charts represent percentages in the row, responses in the column. The pie chart represents percentages by color, meaning green no, blue yes, in answer to the independent variable of have you ever spent any time in prison or jail. And the bar and pie chart shows more than 10% and less than 20% answered yes, and more than 80%, less than 90% answered no. Specifically, per the frequency output, 259 respondents, 14.8% answered yes, and 1,489 respondents, which is 85.2% answered no. For the dependent variable, the chart again represents percentages in the row, responses in the column. Green meaning no, blue meaning yes for the pie chart. And this would be an answer to, are there any situations in which you can imagine you would approve of a policeman striking an adult male citizen? By the bar and pie chart shows more than 60% and less than 80% answered yes, more than 20% and less than 40% answered no. Specifically, per the frequency output, 880 respondents, 68.8% answered yes, and 399 respondents, which is 31.2%, answered no, that they did not approve. Now, moving on to cross-tabulation. Cross-tabulation interpretation is that 69.3% of people with criminal history approve of police striking, and 71.9% of people without a criminal history approve of police striking. That's an epsilon of about 2.6%. So an epsilon is to be ran by row, not column, and in this case, the epsilon shows the difference between the result rows were 2.6% for each row. And as we all know, with an epsilon less than 10%, the relationship may not be worth examining further. However, for our purposes, I just kept on going with the same variables. Moving on to measures of association. The lambda test was used, and it looks at the relationship between one's approval of police striking as the dependent variable and if the person has ever been to prison or jail as the independent. The value of 0.000 or 0% shows that one's history of prison or jail will reduce the error in predicting one's approval of police striking by 0%. The results were expected to be very weak based off of the epsilon results that were received from the cross-tabulation. However, this measure association with lambda shows basically there's no correlation at all. This definitely could mean that the null hypothesis is valid and not rejected. So going on, we did a chi-square for the test of significance. And both the independent and dependent variables were nominal in nature, so the appropriate test was a chi-square. And in order to use the test of significance, we needed to use steps 1 through 5 for hypothesis testing, which are on the bottom right-hand corner. So the research hypothesis is that citizens with criminal history are less likely to approve of police striking than citizens with no criminal history. The null hypothesis is a criminal history does not influence approval of police striking. The level of significance is 0.01. Now, comparing that to the probability that was received from the chi-square, which is the p, P is 0.467. The level of significance is 0.01. Therefore, P is greater than 0.01, meaning a criminal history does not influence approval of police striking, cannot be rejected, and must be accepted.
So this means there is a statistically significant difference between the two groups and that the difference is not attributed to chance or error. And what this test has done is to calculate the probability given the null hypothesis is in fact true. This test has failed to reject the null hypothesis, and this means that the alternate hypothesis cannot be accepted. Because my null hypothesis is true, there is no reason to continue this research, as the probability of receiving wrong output would just be extremely high. So moving on to the conclusion, that was all of our results and all of our tests from class. Because the null hypothesis was determined to be true and it cannot be rejected. Therefore, the alternate hypothesis is discarded and the null hypothesis is accepted. Statistically, this means there's no significant difference between approval of police striking between citizens and citizens with a criminal history. So this compares to the other studies that I mentioned in the literature review. As in, unlike the study conducted by Kahn, Thompson, and McOwen from 2017 that examined public perceptions of police use of force incidents, specifically if the suspect's race and or presence of mental illness influenced individual attitudes associated to the participants' perception, this study shows there is no correlation between variables. The findings from the study conducted by Jeffers, Butcher, and Hanley from 2011 that examined public perceptions of police use of force incidents, specifically of individual biases attributed to their perception, were more closely associated to this study in that the hypothesis was not actually proven true. So my variables relate to those studies, and as far as a current body of literature is concerned, there really is not significant studies specifically regarding these two variables to contribute them to. However, if there was, then I must have done something wrong, because that would mean there's something there to look into. And I found no significance between probability and significance. So although public perceptions of police use of force will continue to more than likely dominate personal opinion in the media, according to this study, one's criminal history has no influence on that perception. Future studies should address a gap in literature regarding criminal history and approval of police use of force, maybe by asking a direct representation of a current criminal population and then comparing that to non-criminal responses, even taken from the GSS. That might pull in different responses, taking them from people who are currently confined. That's another subject, I guess, looking into. This wraps up my presentation on my variables. Thanks for listening. Here are my references from what I used throughout this presentation, things I spoke about, and the couple studies from the literature review. And then here are the image credits from all the images. Of course, the pie charts and tabulations and significance output, everything from there is from SPSS. And thank you for watching. And it's been a pleasure to be in this class. Thanks so much.